A little while ago, we received a lot more information about the new Fire Emblem game, known as Fire Emblem If in Japan. Most people have been focusing on the Famitsu leak, and don't worry, I will talk about that eventually, but in this video, I'm going to discuss everything that we got before the leak, mostly because I was actually planning on doing a video on this stuff long before I even found out about the Famitsu leak. So I'm gonna proceed with this video as normal, and I'll talk about stuff pertaining to the Famitsu leak specifically in the next one. But first I'll talk about a few bits of information that we've got from a few tidbits. Firstly, a few bits of information we found out from a press conference about the Fire Emblem trading card game, at least in Japan, as well as a 4Gamer interview and a few other brief tidbits from Japanese media. Now, unlike the earlier Nintendo Direct, all of this info here comes entirely from Japanese sources, so some of these details may be subject to change in the English release of the game. Just bear that in mind. Obviously, the first big thing that I want to talk about is the dancer girl who's been so prominent throughout all the information we know about this game, finally has a name. Her name is Aqua. Cue birth by sleep jokes here, but I guess it's pretty appropriate considering her hair, and maybe implies some kind of water symbolism. We also have official artwork of her for the first time, which I'm showing right now. She seems to be pretty clearly wielding some kind of lance-like weapon, so clearly there's more to her than just dancing. In fact, this is supported by stats that we've got from her. Now, these stats actually did come from the Famitsu leak. I'm just going to show these very briefly. Aqua's stats very clearly show that she uses lances, as can be seen by that weapon rank there. And she's apparently wielding a Naginata, the Hoshido equivalent of lances. From the looks of things, both sides are going to have different weapon types, but we pretty much knew that already. What's also interesting is the fact that she has luck +4 in her skills. This was a dancer exclusive skill from Awakening, so it confirms that at least some Awakening skills are definitely going to return in this game. And that she definitely has connections to the dancer class. Now, the other skill she has here, we're not really sure what it is. We do know that her class is songstress, and she uses music to let allies move again, rather than dance. This does make a lot of sense, and this isn't the first time we've seen something like this in a Fire Emblem game. Nils from Fire Emblem 7 was a bard who would play his flute to let allies move again, and in Tearing Saga, a game that's not actually a Fire Emblem game, but pretty much is in all but name, there is a character who has a song skill that has a slight chance of letting allies move again. So, oh, and of course, we have the Herons who sing to let allies move again, so this has been done quite a lot in the series. One other interesting thing is, from the looks of things, well, I mean, it's pretty obvious that Aqua's singing is going to be very important to the plot of this game, and it seems like they've really pulled out all the stops here. In the Japanese version, at least, they've hired an actual singer to do her singing voice. One who's not a particularly well-known singer at the moment. She's sort of an up-and-coming one who's actually just starting out with this game, but most people agree that her singing is very, very good. And the fact that they've hired an actual singer to do it really shows that they do want to place some real emphasis on Aqua's songs. Now, if you're interested, there's also a translation of the song that she sings in the trailer that's been out, done by YouTube user Shadow of Chaos. I'll put a link to that in the description if you want to know. The song's lyrics are actually really interesting. They don't seem to pertain directly to anything that we've seen so far in the game, but thematically they could be very significant. While on the subject of Aqua, I might go ahead and mention something that this is technically from the Famitsu leak as well, but again, while we're talking about her, I may as well say this. We now know a bit more about her role in the story. It turns out Aqua is kind of like an inverse of the Avatar. She is the princess of Noor who's been taken captive by Hoshido. So that's interesting. A lot of people are liking the moral ambiguity there, but we don't really know just what significance she has beyond that. She seems to be some kind of Nina or Elincia type of character from the looks of things, based off of that, but as to how her role will unfold, does seem to be pretty interesting. This does beg the question of whether she's related to any of the other members of the Noor royal family, the Avatar's adoptive siblings or not. Next we come to a few other brief bits of information revealed by some Japanese outlets. Firstly is a Fire Emblem If, both Hoshido and Nor, themed set of faceplates for the new 3DS. Unfortunately, Americans are going to get very angry at this, because for some idiotic reason, Nintendo of America decided we don't need the regular new 3DS released in America, we only need the XL version, so no faceplates for you. Finally, you guys understand how I felt for so many years. Bloody Australia never getting anything. So yeah, it's unlikely these faceplates are gonna see much release really, but there is hope that Europe and Australia might get them at least. The real interesting thing that got revealed recently was high-quality box arts for both versions of the game. This is the Hoshido version. Now, we have seen the box art before, but this version does include two new details that we actually hadn't. Firstly, look in the top right corner. This confirms that this game has amiibo support. Now, it was kind of obvious they were going to do this. I mean, a new first-party Nintendo game being released, of course it's going to have amiibo support. But people are still speculating as to what kind of amiibo support will actually be in the game. My guess is that, of course, Marth, Robin, Ike, and Lucina's amiibos will be compatible, for obvious reasons. So, better get to finding those, because they're kind of stupidly rare. I've managed to get hold of all of them except Marth myself, but anyway. The most common speculation here is that in earlier news they confirmed that this game would have DLC characters, like Awakening, and that you'd unlock some DLC characters by entering in codes from the Fire Emblem card game. If that card game never gets released outside Japan, we might need to change some of the unlock methods. But anyway, what people are speculating is that scanning these amiibos may unlock those characters as DLC characters in the same way as Awakening's DLC characters. This is going to be particularly interesting for Robin, because that would kind of be reducing a customizable they are whoever you want them to be character to a static character who's always the same. And that just feels a little weird to me. New mystery of the Emblem's avatar was only alluded to very vaguely in Awakening, and even then, it was ambiguous as to what gender they even were. They left it open for both genders to be canon. With this though, with Robin appearing in Codename Steam with the amiibo only as male, it does feel a little interesting that, I kind of feel, I'm not sure how to feel about the fact that they seem to be canonizing only one form of Robin. It just feels not fair to the whole other, batch of players who prefer the other version of Robin. But not just that, the whole point of Robin is that they have no canon. They are what you decide them to be. Everything about them, who they romance, their appearance, is decided by the player. Even their fate at the end of the game is left completely ambiguous. So, reducing them to just one static character might be a little weird. That's the only issue that I have with this. But Lucina, Ike, and Marth are probably fine to have as DLC characters. Switching over to the Nor box art to talk about the second thing that we know about this, and this is in the bottom left-hand corner. The CERO, that's Computer Entertainment Rating Organization's C rating. Now, the reason why this has sparked such a stir is because this is the highest rating that any Fire Emblem game has ever received in Japan. So, that's kind of a big deal. Now, a whole lot of people are saying that this is a sign the game will be rated M in America. And honestly, I'm not sure that's the case. The CERO C rating is 15+. It's roughly the equivalent to ESRB's T rating. The Japanese equivalent of the M rating for America is D. So obviously this game isn't extreme enough for an M rating, right? Actually, thinking about it, here's the thing. Most Fire Emblem games tend to receive one rating higher outside of Japan than they do within Japan. To put this in perspective, the vast majority of the Fire Emblem series is rated A in Japan, as in all ages, including Fire Emblem 4, the game that features incest and a cult that sacrifices children, both as major plot points, is rated all ages in Japan. Now, this probably could be chalked up to game ratings being less restrictive earlier on. I mean, there are a heck of a lot of games in America that were given really low ratings that, if they were released later, would be given far higher ratings. So, rating systems adapt over time, and usually ratings of more recent games tend to be harsher than earlier games, so I really get the feeling that if Fire Emblem 4 was re-released now, it would get a higher rating than A, but still. What's notable is that Awakening, which is rated T in America, has a B rating in Japan, so the equivalent of E10, and that's the highest the Fire Emblem series has ever gone up until this point. And remember, Awakening featured some very dark things by the series standards. The game opens with the main character stabbing Chrom quite brutally in the chest and killing him, and the bad future timeline, some of the things that are implied to happen there are pretty disturbing. It pretty much features a full-on apocalypse, and not only that, but the sheer amount of sexual innuendo and references in supports was far greater than any previous Fire Emblem game, and this game got a higher rating than that. That actually might say something. Something else to note about Japan's rating system is Ace Attorney Dual Destiny has got a C rating in Japan and was rated M in America. Now, the funny thing about that is that game was only rated the equivalent of E10 in Australia, so, yeah, for all those who say that Australia's rating system is ridiculous about violence, no, actually not. Admittedly though, I am a little worried about the prospect of this game getting an M rating in America. I know that people say that sells well, but it's just that it would really alienate a lot of potential fans from this series. Fire Emblem is not a particularly extreme or graphic series overall, and honestly I think even its darker games are perfectly enjoyable by teenagers, so I'd really hate to cut out a large part of the demographic simply just due to a rating thing. Now, I get the feeling this game will definitely not get the equivalent of an M rating in most countries other than America, and now I don't want to feel like I'm coming off as anti-American or anything, but I personally feel that the ESRB can be a little bit, they're a little too quick to give games higher ratings sometimes, especially the M rating. I personally feel that some games have got those ratings that really didn't deserve it. Persona Q. So really discussing what rating this game will get is not really, well, it depends on what region you're in, because different regions have different standards for ratings. America seems to be harsher on sexual content than it is on violence, while other countries are much harsher on violence than they are on sexual content. So, it kind of depends, but at least we know that this game does have a higher rating than any other game in the series, at least in Japan. And now for something completely different. While we're on the subject of the Nor version box art, there's a character here that I wanted to actually talk about earlier, but I forgot, basically. He's the character on the very far left here. Now everyone else, excluding one of the maids, now we don't know which maid that is, but we do know it's definitely not Felicia, who is shown on the Hoshidor box. But no, I want to talk about the purple-haired, older-looking guy on the far left, because I have a feeling that we've actually seen him before in map footage. See this screenshot of the avatar using his Dragon's Vein, or Dragon Pulse, whatever they call it, ability. Now, draw your attention away from him and look at the other characters. Notice that purple-haired, knight-looking character. Now also notice his health bar. It seems to be a lot higher than everyone else's. If this series follows the same health bar color coding conventions that have existed since Shadow Dragon, the orange part of the other two characters' health bars means they have relatively low HP, whereas the blue going into green of that purple-haired person means their HP is a lot higher. Now, GameXplain previously thought this character was Camilla, but that's clearly not true, because Camilla very obviously appears on the map in another image, and it's much more obviously Camilla. This person, I'm pretty inclined to believe that he's the guy on the far left of the Nor box art, and the fact that this chapter's environment looks very similar to one in which a bandit-looking character threatens the main character, I'm guessing this is a very early game chapter. And because of this, the fact that this character is here, in an early game chapter, he's a knight, and he has higher HP than everyone else, I think we've found our Jagan, folks. And here's where things get more speculative, but actually pretty interesting. So, this character, who I'm assuming is the Jagan of the Nor side, definitely looks a lot like you'd expect for a typical Jagan character. A knight in heavy armor, but who looks older, like around middle age than the other characters. Now contrast this to the character who appears on the far right of the Hoshido box art. From what I can tell, I don't think we've seen this guy in battle very much, and I apologise, it's a little hard to see him due to him blending in with the white sky a bit, but he definitely looks to be much younger than his Nor equivalent, and he also looks more like some kind of butler. So we really don't know what kind of class he's going to be, but this definitely is kind of interesting because we have an age contrast between these two characters. One looks younger and one looks middle-aged. This seems to match up with as a division within the Jagan archetype in the Fire Emblem series, what they call Jagans versus Oifeis. Now, personally, I heavily dislike the term Oifei, because the original Oifei was actually pretty bad in my opinion. But Oifei usually refers to Jagan-type characters who actually have decent growth rates and generally end up a lot better than, you know, the traditional Jagans. Oifeis include Fire Emblem 7's Marcus, Seth, Titania, and Frederick. Most of these characters have one thing in common. They're a lot younger than more traditional Jagans, like the original Jagan and Fire Emblem 6 Marcus. And we see a similar age division between these two characters. Now, I get the feeling that here's just some speculation. Personally, I'm wondering that since the Nor route is not going to have any off-chapter grinding, and it's going to be entirely one chapter to the next with no breaks, that the Nor route may have a more traditional Jagan character, one who exists to serve the role of weakening enemies to let lower-level characters finish them off, and bodyguarding your lower-level characters earlier in the game, but ending up quite bad later on if you over-rely on them. The Hoshido route, due to the fact that it does have opportunities for off-chapter grinding, might have a more Frederick-type character, one who's actually quite decent in their own right, and doesn't really, have terrible growth rates, and more exists just to help you through some earlier chapters until you have access to grinding, but then, well, it's not really necessary to have that much of a punishment for over-relying on them, since you actually don't really need them as much as you would in a route with no grinding. So that's what I personally feel this indicates, but it's pure speculation, and I could be completely utterly wrong. And now we come to the main source of information I wanted to talk about in this video, the 4Gamer interview. This interview can be found on serenesforest.net, I'll probably post a link in the description, but it reveals a lot of very interesting information about this game, so let's see if I'll go through it in order. The biggest thing about this information is that it confirms that the split in versions actually has a lot more than just plot significance. It's also about what kind of playstyle and what kind of Fire Emblem experience you prefer. Now, I'm not exactly a big fan of how they've done this, but the way they've laid it out is, Hoshido is much more like Awakening. It has presumably a traversable world map system, and methods of grinding characters outside of regular chapters. The Nor route, on the other hand, feels more like a traditional Fire Emblem game. You go from chapter to chapter with limited resources, money, and experience, and the difficulty is going to be a lot higher. Also, interestingly, the Nor version is going to include more complicated victory conditions than just rout or defeat boss like Awakening did. So, overall, the split-in versions feels like they're basically saying this: if you liked Awakening, pick Hoshido. If you didn't, pick Nor. And here's the thing, now this is actually going to be less of a speculation thing, and this is more a pure opinion-based thing, really, to me personally. I'm personally not sure I really like their approach here. It's not the two versions, I don't have a problem with that. The problem I have is how they seem to be encouraging segregation within the Fire Emblem fanbase and community. Starting with Fire Emblem 12, Heroes of Light and Shadow, the series developers wanted to make a real effort to make the game appeal to fans who probably wouldn't have tried Fire Emblem before, to newer players, introducing more people to this fantastic series, but not scaring them off with ridiculous difficulty and making it so they can still enjoy it too. But here's the thing, they wanted to do this without alienating their existing fan base. Now, the resulting game was pretty much loved by just about everyone who had a chance to play it, because it was never officially released in English. Newcomers loved it for casual mode and a lot of its other features like that. Veterans still loved it though. I didn't see anyone really complaining about it. Casual mode was entirely optional, and most of the hardcore members of the community absolutely loved Lunatic mode. This game to me was just a perfect harmony of appealing to both casuals and the experienced members of the fanbase, and I just loved what it did. Then came Awakening. Awakening was very clearly trying to do the exact same thing that Fire Emblem 12 did, appeal both to newcomers and to series veterans. However, the results were really not what the developers could have expected. Instead of being a game that was seen as appealing to both groups, Awakening became the newcomer-friendly game of the Fire Emblem series. It attracted an enormous surge of new players, more than any game in the series ever before, and that's a good thing. But what it also did was there was a small but vocal part of the veterans of the fanbase who looked on the game with scorn, hatred, and disgust. How dare this game introduce newcomers to our sacred franchise? How dare it simplify our mechanics? How dare it make this game more casual? Because of this, Awakening became simultaneously the most loved and most hated game in the series in equal measure. Definitely not what the developers were going for. And here's where I have a problem with this game's approach. What I really want to see is, I really want to see an attempt to reharmonize the casual and hardcore sectors of the fanbase again. It's really toxic to a fanbase when you get it to that state where the hardcores of the community utterly demolish the casuals, lay into them and say, "Get the hell out! You scum don't deserve to be in our fanbase!" And so, the new players of the series get scared off. They don't want to be in a community like this, and because of that, eventually, only a very small sector of the fandom are left, and no new players are going to come in. As this continues, your series will eventually die out without any influx of new fans. And that's the problem that I see with this approach, is that rather than trying to resolve this split between the hardcores and the newcomers, it's encouraging it. It's like it's making this gigantic ravine and saying, if you liked Awakening, go on this side. If you didn't like Awakening, go on that side. Don't mix. And I don't think that's a very healthy approach for the fanbase. I admit it's probably the safest thing to do with just how badly Awakening shook things up, and just how horrendous the fanbase became after it. But really, I'm very worried about what this split could potentially do. That's enough ranting here, though. The thing that I find also a bit weird about this is they're putting more complicated victory conditions into just the Nor game. Now, the thing is, I really did like Awakening. Awakening was a great game to me personally, and it is one of my favourites in the series. But I do agree that a major flaw of Awakening was its lack of diverse victory conditions. Honestly, I'm very happy that Seize is gone. I hated Seize, it was such a stupid mechanic, and it just really was kind of annoying. I mean, if there's a boss guarding a castle gate, really the map should just end when you kill the boss, rather than having to move one other arbitrary character onto the Seize spot and select a certain option. It just felt a bit stupid to me, because really, after the guy guarding the gates is down, really the line of defense is already broken and you've pretty much won. So I was glad to see Seize gone, but I did think it was a little weird that you only had Rout and Defeat Boss as victory conditions in that game, and a lot of people agreed with me. Because of that, it felt a bit weird to know that from what it looks like with the Hoshidor campaign, the simplification of victory conditions was actually a conscious decision by the developers. They actually thought that other victory conditions would be more complicated for newer players to understand. And while I do kind of understand that mentality, I mean, maybe they could have incorporated it into the difficulty system somehow. Rather than saying, if you want complicated victory conditions, you have to play this route. Because I know a lot of people who'd prefer to play the Hoshidor route, and yet would want more complicated victory conditions. And this has actually been done before. There are actually quite a few maps in earlier games in the series that do have different victory conditions based on what difficulty that you're playing on. I think it was Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn. I think Radiant Dawn in particular, there are some chapters that have more simple victory conditions on the lowest difficulty mode, but on higher difficulties they actually change them. Like a route becomes a defend mission or something. I forget which missions were actually like this, but I know that it did happen at one point in the series. But anyway, that's sort of enough of that. Now let's be more positive. As for the story of the game, they've predictably said that they've made it so that players will be satisfied playing only one route of the game. They also have finally pretty much outright confirmed that characters who are allies on one route might be enemies on another route. And this was something that was actually, most people guessed this would happen, but it is a very interesting concept. And I'll talk more about that in the next video where I discuss the Famitsu leak, because that goes into a bit more detail on that. But the most interesting detail of this interview by far was when they explained how the route split works. They said that the first few chapters, specifically the first 5 chapters of the game, are the same in both versions. What this confirms is that Chapter 6 is not actually the point of the route split itself, but rather, Chapter 6 itself is actually a different chapter in both versions. What I think this implies is, you won't get the choice of who to side with during Chapter 6, but before Chapter 6 begins. And when you make that choice, you'll then play a different version of Chapter 6 based on who you sided with. So, that seems to be kind of interesting. But here's the really interesting part. They said that the remainder of the game, which is going to be entirely different for both versions, makes up 5/6 of the game. This number is very important, because from this, we can actually deduce how many chapters there are in the game. If the first 5 chapters of the game are the same, and make up 1/6 of the game, that means that to get the total number of chapters, you multiply that by 6. This makes 30 chapters. This is a relatively decent number for main story chapters in a Fire Emblem game. It's roughly on par with Fire Emblem 7 in terms of how many main story chapters. Not quite up there with Radiant Dawn though, which had about 42 main chapters. The thing that I find really interesting is, when they said that each route would be roughly equal to Awakening, they actually kinda meant it. Awakening had 25 chapters. And if this is to be believed, both routes will have exactly 25 unique chapters. So, literally, each route is as long as Awakening. But here's the real point of contention though. Awakening may have had 25 main story chapters, but it had almost as many side chapters as well, making a total of almost 50 chapters, not 25. To really claim that both of these routes would be as long as Awakening, you'd have to have an equal amount of side chapters, and this is where things get kind of a little interesting. Hoshido has already been confirmed to have opportunities to grind outside of the main game. That could feasibly be around the length of Awakening, but what about Nohr? In order for Nohr to be equal to Awakening in length, it would have to have a heck of a lot of side quest chapters. Now, Fire Emblem games without a world map system have had side quest chapters in the past, so it's not unfeasible to think that Nohr would have side quests. The real question is how much. 30 chapters is not bad for main story alone, but if that was all there was, these games would still be disappointingly short. So I'm hoping that we get side chapters like Awakening, and like Awakening that we get lots of them. Now, we also know a few other things regarding these 5 initial chapters that are always the same. Apparently, you won't have to play through them every time you want to play a different storyline. If you do have the DLC for both routes, and they detect a save file from after Chapter 5 on your system, you will get the option to skip the first 5 chapters. Kinda like how you have the option to skip Lynn's story on second playthroughs of Fire Emblem 7. Here, though, we have a slight issue. Yes, you can skip Lynn's story, but it's really not a good idea in practice, because people who played that game will know that if you skip Lynn's story, quite a large chunk of characters will begin the main story, Eliwood's story or Hector's, with their default stats and levels, which if you actually train them in Lynn's route, they'll usually be a lot higher. I'm wondering if the same thing might end up happening here. Yeah, you can skip the initial 5 chapters of the game on secondary playthroughs, but if you do, maybe certain characters might end up having, you know, less opportunities to level up than they would normally, and they might end up with default stats that are weaker than what they'd have if you had played the first 5 chapters, so bear that in mind. Just because you can skip the first 5 chapters of the game doesn't mean that you necessarily want to. The other thing about the first 5 chapters is really interesting. It pertains to the downloadable version of this game. Originally, people were up in arms about the 2-route DLC thing, because the downloadable version of the game has you make a choice at after Chapter 5, presumably, and depending on which route you choose, the other route will be locked off unless you purchase the DLC. So people think, oh, that's a blatant content lock, and there's no reason for that content to be paid for, seeing as it's already on the game that you've got to begin with. Actually, no, interestingly enough. The downloadable version of the game actually contains neither path. You go through the first 5 chapters, and from that point, you are forced to download one of the 2 campaigns to continue. Since you've already paid for the game, you get the first one you choose free. So that's how that works, which is kind of an interesting system. A lot of people are hoping that the first 5 chapters would actually be a demo. You download a free demo that covers the first 5 chapters, and once you get to Chapter 5, you then get the option to purchase one version of the full game. That may have worked a little better, and it would actually be kind of a cool concept. This interview finishes by talking very briefly about the third path. They're kind of keeping it under wraps at the moment, but they say that its difficulty will be roughly between Hoshido and Noa. The other thing they're saying, though, is that if you want to play the storyline of the Noa version, but are a bit worried about the difficulty, you will have the option to lower the difficulty level. Apparently mid-game. Now, they give more details about this in the Famitsu leak, so I'll talk about that in the next video. Speaking of which, that is the end of this video. That's all I want to talk about here. Next time we get into the real meat of what's been revealed recently, and most likely the views that you've all been waiting for, the infamous Phoenix mode. So, I'll see you then.